There is a huge difference between trauma bonding and bonding over trauma. Bonding over trauma is a natural response to an unhealthy experience in order to build a healthier connection. Being able to commiserate is a wonderful way to cope with shitty circumstances. It is a necessary aspect of healing, but the idea of trauma bonding is a whole different ballgame, one that is far less fun to play. According to Medical News Today, the official definition of trauma bonding is a psychological response to abuse. It occurs when a person who was victimized forms an unhealthy bond with the person who victimized them. The person receiving or experiencing abuse may develop some sort of sympathy with their abusers. Because of the cycle of abuse and the nature of it, it reinforces a lot of addictive qualities, especially if those cycles of abuse are followed by remorse or apologies. Even if they're sincere, that give, that take, that not knowing what to expect is toxicity. But the promise of a change in behavior can lead us to giving extra chances. And though it's debunked, it's talked about enough that I think we should discuss Stockholm Syndrome. Stockholm Syndrome was at the time thought of as a type of trauma bonding, defined as a psychological response that people associate with the kidnapping hostage situation where the hostages bonded with the people holding them hostage. But basically, a person with Stockholm Syndrome develops positive associations with their captors or their abusers. And though we'll be talking more generally about trauma bonding and less specifically than that syndrome, I do think it's important to recognize that in most of these types of relationships, there's an imbalance in the power dynamic. We have to recognize that the relationship is something that happens over time. And when things happen gradually, it's much harder to notice, especially when you're living it or experiencing it. I think something that I often overlooked when I would learn about things like this is that sometimes even the abuser does not realize that they're the ones perpetuating toxic cycles of harm and then consolation. And not to sympathize with an abuser, but to better understand the nuance and what we mean when we say trauma or abuse, because sometimes it is explicit and menacing, but other times and often it's from somebody we love and we trust, and that makes it so much more confusing. Either way, we do know now that that intermittent reinforcement creates a sense of addiction, a sense of need. And after doing a ton of research and a ton of self-reflection that I did not want to do and probably didn't need to do at the time, but I'm glad I did it, I realized that I've been in various forms of trauma-bonded relationships my entire life, from coworkers in toxic work environments to my mom to exes. In some capacity, trauma bonding is a pretty common occurrence. When we're in toxic, abusive relationships or environments, we tend to hold strong bonds with the people with us, especially if we're people pleasers or people with insecurities, or if we've just never seen healthy relationships modeled. We're really susceptible to this kind of connection. But for me, when I was younger, I had a real strong tendency to put people I was dating or that I was attracted to on a pedestal. And when I would put a person on a pedestal, they could do no wrong. I found it really easy to empathize with every action they took, especially if their intention was good, even if it harmed me. And though I think it's good to be able to see people for their potential, it's not good to live in that. If people aren't behaving in their fullest potential, stop pretending like they are. So yes, my optimism is not an asset that I want to give up within my relationships or my connections, but learning specific boundaries and specific red flags has helped me a lot in sustaining those relationships in a healthy capacity. Because understanding where someone is coming from helps us see the reasoning in it, but that doesn't mean we have to accept it or correct it or respect it. So if there's ever an imbalance of power or ongoing abuse, isolation, and or a sense of oscillation between warmth and reliability and attention and violence or neglect, there is some level of trauma bonding that is kind of guaranteed. So one of the first things that we need to look out for is toxicity in your own relationships. And there are a lot of nuanced ways a relationship can be toxic. So you want to root out that toxicity so it doesn't poison the whole well. In my experience, the most basic red flag in a relationship is an obvious power differential, whether I idolize them or they idolize me. If there is an imbalance in the way one partner is treating another partner, it's not always healthy. And if you don't uproot that toxicity, it can continue to spread. Unbalanced and toxic relationships are really hard to recognize if clear violent acts are not taking place. This is why so many people people spend so many years molding and forcing themselves into relationships that were poisonous for both parties. And we have no idea when we're in it because we don't have the introduction of the language of toxic relationships or trauma bonding as anything other than manipulative and controlling and obvious. But a lot of the time, it's way less explicit than that. People who prey upon kindness and generosity and people who are people pleasers tend to get in relationships that are really imbalanced. It's good to notice ahead of time so you can uphold boundaries to keep both of you safe, because I can't stress enough how nuanced and subtle so many signs can be. And obviously, if you are in an explicitly trauma bonded relationship and it is truly unhealthy, there are ways to seek professional help. I am not it. No one on the internet is. That said, there are resources available to you. I'll put as much as I know in the comment box, but I'm also not the end all be all for knowing any of this. That said, I'm just speaking more on general terms because I saw some explicit abuse growing up. So I definitely promised myself that I would never get into abusive relationships. And that made me feel lucky because I avoided tons of patterns of toxicity and abuse, but it made other forms go really undiagnosed. And I think they're the common ones to go unseen because nice guy syndrome or love bombing, all of those things come into play because we're all desperate to feel seen and heard. And some of us haven't learned how to communicate properly yet. And we put it on our loved ones to teach us. And that's not fair. In my experience, I find that just because you can see where the oppressor is coming from, it does not mean that you can't stand up for the rights of the oppressed throughout the process. Because typically the oppressors are the people who are being the least affected by this. The general population are. And that goes for relationships too. Just because you can see where your partner's coming from doesn't mean you need to blame yourself for their negative reactions or responses to those relationship needs and essentials. I wanted to add this. Trauma bonding is not love. It can feel like love, but it's not. Trauma bonding is the distorted echo of past pain that makes that feel like the only solace. But there is more out there. Keep searching, keep refreshing. It doesn't mean you have to uproot all your relationships, but it does mean you can examine some for the ones you've been lacking boundaries in. I love you. For more content like this, you can subscribe to my Patreon where I have heavier stuff. Otherwise, you can listen to the daily episodes anywhere you listen to podcasts. It's called Make Your Damn Bed Podcast. You can look that up or look me up, Julie Merica. But you can find this full episode in its original format there. You can also sign up for the newsletter and get access to the YouTube, the Instagram, the TikTok. You can also get a newsletter, which I try to include actionable stuff. This month, it was about learning a language and some of the hacks and tricks I've been using to get fluent. I'm someone who knew nothing. Otherwise, feel free to subscribe on YouTube. I've got more stuff here, and I'm going to be adding a lot more stuff in the future. I love you so much. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll talk to you tomorrow while you make your damn bed. Bye, cutie.